Hello friends and welcome back. My name is Katie and today I'm going to be reviewing the Book of Tea duology by Judy I. That is book 1, A Magic Steeped in Poison, and the recently released book 2, A Venom, Dark and Sweet. This is a YA high fantasy story that is one of those YAs that's actually appropriate for younger teens. I would say that this is generally fine for 13 and over, although there are some trigger warnings which I'll talk about later, so be sure to check those. As I said, this is a high fantasy story based on Chinese culture and Chinese mythology, and it also has like a historical kind of feeling and setting to it. In this story, our protagonist's name is Ning. She's a young woman who lives in a small town with her family, and at the beginning of the story we find out that her mother has died and her sister is dying from having consumed a poisonous tea. This world is ruled by an emperor, but he is currently unwell, and so his daughter, the princess, is ruling in his stead. And she is hosting a tournament or a competition to find her Xinnongshe. Xinnongshe are basically like master tea makers, and the magic in this world revolves around that tea making. Whoever wins this competition will become like the imperial Xinnongshe and will also receive a favor from the princess. So in desperation, Ning decides to join this competition despite not being like a trained and proper tea maker, in hopes of winning so that she can ask the princess to help her sister recover from this poisonous tea. So that's the setup, and as I said, the magic in this world revolves around tea making. And honestly, this has to be my favorite part of the book. Essentially, there are people in this world who have a spiritual connection to the art of tea making and who can be very selective about the ingredients that they use and the way that they brew tea to create a connection between themselves and other people, or to influence themselves and other people. The magic itself and how it's performed and described has a very sensual kind of spiritual feeling to it, and honestly it's just beautiful to read about. This skill and talent for tea making seems to be one that is like inherited, but also one that needs to be trained and developed. So it's clear early on that rather than being someone who has been schooled in the like specific techniques and rules around tea making, Ning is instead someone who has developed an intuitive gift for it. As far as the plot's concerned, we definitely dive headfirst right into the story after the inciting incident of finding out that Ning's mum has passed away, her sister is unwell, and that she is going to compete in this tournament. Once she reaches the capital, it's pretty clear early on that Ning is kind of out of her depth in terms of the politics and the culture of the capital. And so while we do see quite a lot of like the actual trial happening on page, a lot of this first book in particular is also about the politics of the court and the capital. It soon becomes clear that not all is as it seems, and that this poisonous tea that has affected her family is actually more widespread than she first imagined. And then there's plenty of questions around who she can trust. So I think the main thing that I absolutely loved about this story was the cozy kind of feeling that came along with so much description of tea. Quite a lot of page time is taken up with descriptions of people brewing tea and like taking the time to select different ingredients for different purposes, and like describing the aromatics of it, the tastes of it, and just the feeling of both like creating tea and also drinking it. Like it's just all so beautiful and cozy. And then similarly with food, there's a lot of very vivid descriptions of food throughout as well. And so all of that results in some very cozy, warm vibes. Another thing I really liked about this story, and in particular, again, the first one, is how female-centered it felt. Obviously, our main character is Ning. She's a young woman. She is going to the capital city in hopes of saving her sister who she adores. She's also dealing with the grief of having lost her mother, who she also adored. And then in the capital city, she meets several women as well, who she forms different kinds of relationships with. Some are really good friendships that are just beautiful to watch. Others are a little bit more complicated and we're not always sure about the intentions. But especially in the first book, the primary actors in here, the vast majority of them are women. Along with that, I also liked how the author clearly intentionally subverted some pretty stereotypical, like sexist kind of tropes in YA that we see an awful lot. Without giving too much away, it's clear that the author didn't want to pit women against women or to center a romance too heavily over the other relationships that were being developed. And I liked that. I liked that although a bit of a romance does develop, it doesn't take center stage, at least in this first novel. That there is still room for Ning as a character to exist and to develop, as well as other relationships with other people. I thought the balance between the politicking that was going on, as well as like the adventure and excitement and tension of the trial was managed really well. I loved how mythology and the gods and legends that are a part of this world are also brought in, both in the story in general, but also into the art of tea making. The gods feel very present. So outside of just the magic of tea making, that makes this whole world feel quite magical too. Some things that could be a positive or a negative depending on your personal preferences. And that would be the pacing of this story. Although there are some parts that feel quite exciting and fast-paced, overall this book really takes its time, or the series really takes its time when it wants to. Those are some of my favorite parts, so I really enjoyed that, but I know other readers might not enjoy slowing down to take that time with tea or with food quite as much as I did. And honestly, I'm not entirely sure, but having read some other reviews, I get the feeling that if you're more a plot-driven reader, you might struggle with this a little bit. Although there is definitely plot carrying this book forward and this series forward, I don't think it's the plot that you come for. For me, at least, it was the atmosphere, the vibes, the coziness that I came for and that I enjoyed the most. The plot works, it's serviceable, but it's not the star of the show, I guess. Another thing that might be a bit divisive is the romance. Now, one of the things that I liked a lot about it is that it didn't feel like it took over the story in book one. It became more of a plot focus in book two, obviously, but it is a bit insta-lovey. Although they don't get together immediately and there's a lot of complications around their romance, there is definitely an immediate connection. Another thing is that although I really loved the many kinds of platonic and romantic relationships explored in this book, it did primarily feel like Ning's story. She is definitely the character we spend the most time with. In this first book, she is our only point of view. So although I enjoyed the cast, it's definitely a story about Ning. And of course, although it is a duology, both of these books are quite short. I think between them, this series might be a total of 700 pages. So I did kind of feel like we could have spent a little bit more time with those secondary characters, and I think I would have enjoyed that, sort of exploring them more as people and following along in their journeys. Especially in the second book, and I suppose I'll get to how the first and the second book differ a little bit now. The second book definitely did sort of sideline some characters that I'd really grown to like and enjoy in the first book. And they seemingly did get up to some interesting things, but it all happened off page. So I don't know, I can see a world in which this is sort of fleshed out to be like a bit of a longer story, maybe even a trilogy, and where we get to follow those secondary characters a little bit more. And I think that could have resulted in a bit more of a fleshed out story overall. Another big difference between the first and the second book is that the first book is primarily focused on this trial and the politicking in the capital, whereas the second book opens up into almost more this like quest. We get an additional point of view in the second book. It definitely feels like the series goes from like this small kind of trial politicking situation to almost like this epic chosen one kind of quest between the books. The story definitely continues, but the feeling and the vibe, there's a big switch up in the storytelling and the focus, I guess. All of that I didn't really mind. One thing that I didn't love so much, and is the reason that I didn't adore the second book in the same way I did the first, is the fact that with the second point of view in the second book, as well as the exploration of what's actually going on, there isn't so much nuance and confusion, I suppose, about the intentions of different people. It's much more clear in the second book who the bad guys are, and there ultimately is like a big bad. And one of the things I liked so much about this first book is the uncertainty about who we could trust and what was going on and where different people's loyalties lay. Most of that is pretty much gone by the second book. We know who the bad guys are, we know what we need to do in order to overcome the bad guys, and it's a quest to get there. Another thing that I know some people have said that they didn't like about this, but honestly it didn't bother me, I think I just suspended my disbelief enough to enjoy what was being presented, was the fact that, as I said at the beginning, Ning is not a trained Xingnunshu. She has not been trained by her mother in this art of tea making, and yet it's clear that she's very good at it. Basically, we're told she's an amateur, but she doesn't feel like an amateur. It didn't bother me personally, I think because I was just enjoying the descriptions of the tea making so much that I wasn't overthinking the situation too bad. Now briefly, some of the trigger warnings. If these concern you, definitely look into them further on the story graph, but some of those are violence, death, including of a parent, mass murder, animal abuse, and then some general unrest and war. Overall, I personally really enjoyed this. I think I would give this duology like an average of 4 stars. For me, it was just the atmosphere and the vibes of it all that I loved and I completely sunk into. The descriptions of the tea were so evocative and immersive. I really appreciated those female friendships that were really well explored, especially in the first book. I loved the setting and the magic, and not just the magic of the tea, but the way that the mythology and the gods and the legends were interwoven into almost every element of the story as well. Although there are some very high stakes and some solid tension, overall it felt very warm and cozy. I think there was a beautiful balance between the two, I suppose, of feeling like there was momentum with the plot and there was tension and complication, while still allowing time and space to explore this beautiful, sensual, evocative magic system. And I do like that this is a short, easy read because it's not intimidating at all, but I also I loved this world so much that I would love to see it explored even further and to have more from these characters too. So anyway, those are my brief thoughts on the Book of Tea duology by Judy I. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below if you have read this duology. If you haven't yet read it and you have more questions for me, feel free to leave them in the comments below. I'll do my best to get back to you. A big thank you to my patrons over on Patreon, especially to Livia, Lynette Brown, and Marie. Let me know in the comments below if you're considering picking this duology up. I would love to talk to you about books. And until the next time, happy reading. Bye.